Welcome back, my friend, and thank you for joining me tonight on Fogman Stories. Do you believe that some cries are not for help, but quiet prayers still waiting to be heard? That somewhere in the silence of the night, a soul may still be longing for remembrance, on a lonely hill in northern Spain, where fog clings to the graves and the cold wind hums through the trees. There is an ancient cemetery where, each year on All Souls' Day, a faint, sorrowful cry can be heard. No one knows where it comes from. No one dares to stay long enough to find out. That is, until a young priest named Mateo arrived at the old parish and was drawn into a mystery hidden beneath the earth. Buried in silence, and held together by one fragile thread, faith. What you're about to hear is a true Catholic spiritual story, slow, mysterious, and moving, a journey into the heart of forgotten souls, and a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, God's mercy still finds a way. If you find stories like this worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video to help Fogman keep these sacred tales alive. Now, let us begin Chapter 1, The Cemetery on the Hill. Chapter 1, The Cemetery on the Hill. I was not afraid of silence. In fact, it had always been something of a friend to me. Silence filled the long corridors of seminary halls, wrapped itself around early morning prayers, and stood still in the empty pews of the churches I had served before. But what I found in Galicia, this silence was different. It was listening. The year I was reassigned to the parish of Santa Lucia, I had just turned 33, young for a priest. Some would say, though not without experience. My superiors had described the village as peaceful, remote, with a dwindling number of faithful, a quiet place for quiet service. They did not mention the cemetery. Santa Lucia sat nestled in the hills of northern Spain, surrounded by fog that rolled down from the mountains like a slow exhale from the heavens. It was beautiful in its own melancholic way. The church was modest, its white stone walls cracked with age, and the bell tower leaned slightly, as if weary from holding time. Behind it, a steep footpath led up to a small hill where the cemetery lay. A wrought iron gate stood at its entrance, tangled with ivy, crosses, some standing proud, others weathered into almost illegible stone, dotted the hill like silent sentinels. The oldest graves rested near the top, close to a crumbling wall that had once been part of a monastery long forgotten. They said it was built in the 1500s. Padre Mateo, the villagers greeted me with cautious warmth. Most were older, having lived their entire lives among the fog and stone. Children were few. I quickly learned that Galicia held tightly to its traditions, both sacred and strange. I remember the first time someone mentioned the crying. It was an old woman named Ines, who brought a basket of bread to the rectory shortly after my arrival. We sat at the small kitchen table, drinking dark coffee as she asked about my background, my family, my prayers, and what do you think of the cemetery? She asked, eyes narrowing. It is peaceful, I replied, a bit overgrown, but dignified. She nodded slowly, then said, almost in a whisper, you will hear her too. On the night of the Holy Souls, November the 2nd, I tilted my head, unsure what she meant. She crossed herself, murmured a Hail Mary, and said no more. That night, I wrote it off as local superstition, the kind of story that keeps folklore alive. Every place has its ghost tales. After all, I had heard plenty during my training. Headless monks in France, weeping saints in Italy, statues that moved, candles that flickered on their own. Still, something about the way she said it, "You will hear her too," lodged itself deep in my mind. I began to ask questions, gently at first, during confessions, after Mass, in passing conversations. The same story returned in fragments on the 2nd of November. At night, from the hill, a cry, faint, female, sorrowful, and always, without fail, there would be no one to be seen. Some villagers avoided the hill entirely that week. Others lit candles on their windowsills and prayed the rosary until dawn. Curious, I searched through the parish records. The cemetery had been consecrated in 1584. It had survived wars, plagues, revolutions. Burials ceased in the upper section in the late 1800s, when the newer plots were added to the south side. But there was no mention of a haunting, no tragedy officially recorded. Still, I felt the weight of something unsaid, a tension in the way people averted their gaze when the cemetery was mentioned, as though the hill itself watched them back. On crisp autumn mornings, I took to walking the grounds alone. I'd climb the narrow path behind the sacristy, listening to the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and open the iron gate with both hands. The air always felt colder inside the cemetery, not just in temperature, but in texture. Denser. Still, I'd kneel by the oldest graves, whisper prayers for names that had long faded from stone. Sometimes I felt as though the ground was listening, not watching, listening, as though something beneath the soil waited for someone to speak its name. One afternoon, I met an old caretaker named Joaquin. He had worked the cemetery grounds for 40 years, though his back now bent low, and his hands trembled slightly. "Have you ever heard the cry?" I asked him. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a rosary made of black beads, the crucifix worn smooth from decades of use. He handed it to me. "For the night," he said, "if you choose to stay." "Stay for what?" He looked at me, his eyes misty with something I couldn't quite place. "Sometimes the dead want to be remembered. That's all." After that, I could no longer pretend I wasn't drawn to the mystery. Something within me, a stirring, perhaps, of purpose or of empathy, felt pulled toward that hill. I marked the calendar. November 2nd, All Saints' Day came and went in quiet reverence. The church was fuller than usual, with many lighting candles and murmuring prayers for the saints. But the next day, the Day of the Dead, All Souls, held a more solemn tone. The village seemed to breathe slower. Doors stayed shut, curtains drawn. Only the scent of burning wax drifted through the streets. That evening, I walked alone up the path behind the church, holding Joaquin's rosary in my hand. Fog crept low along the ground. The sky was moonless, blanketed in cloud. I wore my cassock, a cloak wrapped tight against the wind. The iron gate opened with a moan. The graves greeted me like old friends. I moved slowly between them, whispering prayers for the departed, feeling the air grow ever more still. At exactly midnight, I heard it, A sound so soft, I almost fought at the wind until it came again. A low, aching sob, human, feminine, somewhere near the top of the hill. I stood frozen. The sob came again, this time laced with a breathless pain that made my heart ache. I turned toward the oldest graves, toward the crumbling wall, but there was no one. Just rows of crosses, stones overgrown with moss, and silence. Then, again, a cry, one note longer this time, fragile as glass. I stepped forward, each footfall echoed louder than it should have. The sound didn't move, it stayed rooted, as if coming from the earth itself. I knelt by a sunken stone, fingers clutching the rosary, and began to pray aloud. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. The sobbing stopped. I waited, heart pounding. The silence that followed was not empty. It was deep, saturated with something unspoken, a presence, not evil, not threatening, but wounded. I remained there for over an hour, praying, listening, hoping. When I finally stood and turned to leave, I felt a cold brush at my shoulder. Not a hand, not wind, just a passing sorrow. I left the cemetery that night with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain: someone or something was weeping in that place, and I intended to find out why. Chapter 2. Whispers from Beneath. There is something peculiar about the hours just before dawn. The world grows still, time softens, and prayers spoken in that silence seem to rise more swiftly to heaven, or perhaps deeper into the earth. It was during one of those hours, long after midnight, that I sat alone in the chapel. The candles had burned low, their wax pooled on the altar like tear stains. Outside, the fog lay heavy against the stained glass windows, casting blurred halos of red and blue upon the stone floor. I had been praying the office for the dead, as I often did now, ever since the night I heard the cry. That sound had not returned, not with the same clarity, and yet a weight lingered in the air, like the final note of a hymn that never quite faded. I couldn't forget it, wouldn't. It had awakened something in me. The chapel was empty, as always, but I had begun to sense, more and more, that my solitude was shared. It was nearing 4 in the morning when I heard it. A faint, brittle sound, not like the cry from the hill. No, this was different, a shifting, scraping sort of noise, almost like stone brushing against stone. I stood slowly, heart suddenly alert. The sound did not come from the chapel. It came from behind it, from the hill. I took the lantern and stepped outside, pulling my cloak tight. The air was sharp with cold, thick with moisture. Every step I took up the familiar path felt louder than it should have, my boots crunching the gravel beneath. No moon, just black sky and the thin breath of wind. As I reached the cemetery gate, the sound returned, fainter now, as if retreating. Still, it was there, something beneath the earth. I stood for a long moment, listening. Nothing. Just when I turned to go, a whisper brushed the edge of hearing. Not a word, not even a voice, just the suggestion of one, like someone trying to speak from behind a wall. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lit every candle in the rectory and pulled out the old parish records again. I began with burial logs, then sacramental registries, then shifted to architectural plans. My eyes ached. The pages were brittle and yellowed. Some had faded beyond recognition. But at the back of one book, wedged between the binding and the board cover, I found something. A letter. The parchment was stiff with age, and the ink had browned to near invisibility. But I could still make out the writing. It was unsigned, undated, but clearly the hand of a priest. The Latin was formal, almost desperate in tone. For the souls beneath, forgotten even by time, not condemned, but confined, their rest incomplete, for the prayers meant for them were never spoken. I beg the mercy of God for them, and if I cannot offer absolution, then let this letter remain, that one day someone might remember them. Beneath this was a scrawled note, harder to decipher. Do not break the seal below the stone, unless you are ready to carry their sorrow. I held the paper for a long time. Could this be the answer? A crypt beneath the cemetery? Nothing of the sort had been mentioned in the parish records, at least. Not in the official ones. But old churches, especially those built on monastic grounds, often had hidden places, ossuaries, catacombs, plague vaults, and there had been plague here. I recalled a brief note from a much older journal. Epidemic of 1597. Entire convent sealed. My breath caught. There had been a convent. I spent the next week combing through the oldest archives I could find. I asked the bishop's office for permission to access diocesan records from the 16th century. It took time, too much. My dreams grew troubled. The chapel seemed colder. Even the villagers grew more distant, watching me with the wary gaze of those who feared that something long buried might surface again. At last, I was granted access to a folio labeled Santa Lucia, Ecclesiastical Holdings 1580 to 1600. There, buried beneath inventories of chalices and handwritten homilies, was a map, faded, barely legible. It showed the original grounds of the church and cemetery, and beneath the northern slope of the hill, a rectangular outline. No label, just one word, written beside it: Silentium, silence. I took the map, copied it by hand, and marked the spot on the hill. That night, under a moonless sky, I returned to the cemetery with a spade, a lantern, and Joaquin's rosary. I wasn't seeking to dig graves. I sought only the truth. I paced to where the map suggested and began brushing aside the fallen leaves. Beneath them, I found a slab of stone, almost flush with the earth, moss-covered, cracked. In its center was a small iron ring, a sealed entrance. I knelt beside it, fingers resting on the cold metal, and whispered a prayer. Lord, if what lies beneath has waited for remembrance, let this be a beginning. If it is not your will, let the stone remain closed. I tugged. The ring held. Once, twice. Then, with a long, aching groan, the slab shifted. Beneath it, darkness, a hollow space. The air that escaped was dry and stale, tinged with the scent of dust and something else, old wood. Old sorrow. I did not go down that night. I replaced the stone, marked its place, and returned to the chapel to pray. The next morning, I told no one, but in my heart, I knew. The cry I had heard was not just grief. It was memory, and memory, unspoken, can become a wound that never heals. Chapter 3. The Name of Maria. Some names cling to a place like mist to the branches of a cypress tree. You don't see them at first, but they are there, quiet, patient, waiting to be spoken aloud again. It was an overcast morning when I first met Sister Elena. She lived just a few hundred yards from the cemetery, in a modest stone cottage veiled with ivy and crowned by a slate roof that had weathered more storms than any of us could remember. Though not officially a nun anymore, her convent had closed decades prior. People still called her sister, out of love and habit, and perhaps, too, because she still carried something sacred in the way she moved. Her face bore the softness of age, pale eyes, thin white hair coiled beneath a woolen shawl, and a voice that quivered not from weakness but reverence. She invited me in for tea. The inside of her home smelled faintly of beeswax, dried rosemary, and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, crucifixes, and small hand-carved statues of saints. "I've been expecting you," she said, pouring tea into a chipped porcelain cup. "You have," she smiled gently. "Any priest who lingers near the cemetery eventually finds his way here." I didn't know what to say to that, so I simply sipped the tea. It was stronger than I expected. She sat across from me and folded her hands. "You've heard the cry, haven't you?" I nodded. "And you found the stone?" "Yes." For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she stood and walked to an old writing desk. From a drawer, she pulled out a small bundle wrapped in faded linen. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a brittle notebook bound in red thread. "This belonged to my great-grandmother," she said. "She was just a girl when the fever came for Santa Lucia. She saw things, heard things, and she wrote it all down." I took the journal in trembling hands. The pages were yellowed and smelled faintly of lavender. The ink had faded, but her handwriting was elegant, looped, careful. Near the center of the journal, a name repeated over and over. "Maria, Maria, Maria." I looked up. She was a servant girl. Sister Elena whispered, "Worked at the church, lived in the sacristy, barely 16, during the plague of 1597, when panic gripped the town. She developed a fever. The villagers assumed she carried the pestilence. They feared she might infect the priest." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "But she didn't have the plague. It was only exhaustion and grief. The priest tried to protect her, but others intervened. They sealed her in the crypt beneath the cemetery with those who had already died." My chest tightened. "She was buried alive?" Sister Elena nodded, "and she cried. For hours, they said, maybe longer. But no one returned. No one opened the stone. Only the priest stayed, kneeling in prayer until his own death some weeks later." I opened the final pages of the journal. There, in faint ink, were words that shook me. Father Andres wrote, "Lord, have mercy on Maria, the one whom the world rejected, yet never ceased to believe in you." It felt like a wound reopening across centuries. That night, I could not sleep. I walked to the cemetery, lantern in hand, heart full of sorrow. I stood before the stone I had uncovered, where now the name Maria echoed in my thoughts like a bell tolling in fog. I knelt, not as a priest performing duty, but as a man asking forgiveness on behalf of those long gone. I began to pray, "Eternal rest grant unto her, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon her." And then the next night, and the next, each night I returned, bringing candles, flowers, the sound of whispered psalms. I didn't always pray aloud. Sometimes I simply sat. I brought a small stool and a blanket and remained until the stars faded. There was something profoundly human about being there, about remembering someone forgotten. One night, after hours of silent prayer, I felt a change in the air. A breeze rose from nowhere, stirring the grass. My candle flickered and went out, but I did not feel afraid. Instead, I heard, so faintly I almost missed it, a sigh. Not sorrowful this time, but soft, like relief. I looked up toward the crosses and whispered, "Maria." The air stilled, and I felt, for the first time in weeks, a peace that was not mine. Chapter 4. Night of the Souls. All Souls' Day arrived with the weight of ancient grief. The sky was dark long before evening, and a storm rolled over the hills like a mourning veil drawn slowly across the face of the earth. The rain began just after sunset, soft at first, then steadily harder, tapping against the chapel windows like 1,000 tiny prayers. Still, I prepared myself to go. I knew I had to. I pulled my cloak around me, fastened the collar tight, and took the lantern from its hook. The flames inside flickered uncertainly, as though they too were unsure whether to brave the night. Downstairs, I found a few of the villagers waiting near the church doors. I hadn't asked them to come. There was Maria Antonia, who lit a candle for her son every day since the accident, and old Luis, who hadn't attended Mass in years but now clutched his rosary like a lifeline. A teenage girl named Sophia, holding her grandmother's hand, and behind them, 2 more families I didn't recognize. No one spoke. They simply followed me out into the storm. We climbed the path behind the chapel in single file, heads bowed, rain soaking through our coats and scarves. Lightning cracked once above the ridge, briefly illuminating the cemetery in ghostly silver. I saw crosses glistening like bones, stones slick with rain. The broken crucifix near the top of the hill leaned forward as if it, too, had something to confess. I opened the iron gate. It groaned under the weight of time. We stepped inside. I took my place near the center, where the oldest graves surrounded us like forgotten saints. My fingers tightened around Joaquin's rosary as I began to pray aloud. Requiem aeternam dona eis, Domini, et lux perpetua luci thais. The others joined in, their voices trembling, a fragile chorus against the roar of the wind. Then, it came, the cry, not faint, not whispering. A long, aching wail rose from the earth itself, echoing through the stones like a hymn of sorrow that had waited centuries to be sung. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I heard someone drop their candle. A few people instinctively stepped back, and then another sound, a rustle, like fabric moving against stone. I turned toward the shattered crucifix. There, beside it, barely visible in the veil of rain, stood a figure, a girl. She wore white, though the rain soaked her dress and hair until both clung to her like threads of shadow. Her face was pale, indistinct, like a memory blurred with tears. Her eyes, though, her eyes were fixed on us with an expression not of anger, but longing, hope, even. Sophia screamed. Her grandmother pulled her back. Someone fell to their knees. And still, the girl did not move. She stood, silent, beneath the crucifix, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer. I stepped forward, one pace, then two. The cold hit me like a wall, not the kind that chills the skin, but the kind that stills the soul. My breath caught, my heart slowed, but I kept walking. "Maria," I whispered. The figure tilted her head. I dropped to my knees. "We remember you," I said. "We are here for you. You are not forgotten." The wind rose, whipping the trees and scattering petals from the candles. Yet within the storm, the presence before me seemed calm, almost serene. She raised one hand, not in farewell, but in blessing. Then, she was gone. The light shifted. The storm began to quiet. Behind me, someone fainted. I turned and saw Maria Antonia cradling Luis, who had collapsed. We helped him back down to the rectory, where he revived with warm blankets and whispered. She was real. I saw her. By morning, the storm had passed. The ground was soaked, but the air carried a strange peace. In the days that followed, word spread through the village, not as gossip, but as reverence. People came with flowers, candles, silent prayers. Some asked me about what I saw. Most simply knelt beside the old graves, tears mixing with rain. One elderly man left a bouquet with a note, "To Maria, who waited, forgive us." That night, I returned to the hill alone. The broken crucifix stood quietly, the stone beneath it still slick with rain. I sat near it and whispered a psalm. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." I no longer feared the presence on the hill, because I knew it was not wrathful. It was waiting, and now it had been heard. Chapter 5. Opening the Crypt. There are things you carry in your soul that no weight can measure. For me, it was the moment she vanished. That night beneath the broken crucifix, Maria's final gaze, her hand raised not in despair but in blessing, left a mark on me deeper than words. I knew then that the sorrow lingering in the cemetery was not rooted in vengeance. It was in longing, in memory, and it was time to open what had been sealed. I requested an emergency audience with the bishop the next day. The Diocese of Lugo, where Santa Lucia fell under jurisdiction, was not quick to respond to such matters. But when I spoke, softly but firmly, about the unmarked crypt beneath the cemetery, about the historical journal, the centuries-old letter hidden in our archives, and most importantly, the presence we had all witnessed, they listened. The bishop, a stern but thoughtful man named Ignacio, asked only one question after I finished. "Do you believe this will bring peace?" "Father Mateo, I do," I answered, "not only to the dead, but to the living, too." He nodded once and gave his blessing. By Friday, permission was granted. We agreed on strict guidelines. A team of restoration professionals and historians from the diocese would assist, and everything would be documented. The work was to be done with reverence. No media, no spectacle, only prayer. It was a gray, hushed morning when we gathered at the cemetery. I had marked the slab weeks ago, and now a crew of 4 men with gloves and careful hands began brushing away the earth and roots. The stone was thicker than expected. Beneath it, there were bricks, centuries old, fused with lime and time. It took hours to loosen them. The work was slow, intentional. When the final layer of mortar cracked and fell away, we waited. Then the stone lid lifted. A hollow, aching sound filled the air, as if the earth itself exhaled. A scent drifted out, startling in its clarity, not the rot or dust we had expected, but something floral, faint, almost like wilted roses, not fragrant in the living sense, but reminiscent of prayers whispered over graves. The passage below was narrow, barely wide enough for one person to descend. A rusted iron ladder led into the dark. I volunteered to go first. Lantern in hand, I climbed slowly down into the crypt. The air was dry, still. The walls, made of stone and clay, were lined with carved alcoves. Most were empty. A few held remnants of coffins, disintegrated wood, rusted nails, scraps of cloth, and bones. So many bones, stacked in corners, laid in rows, reverently, I hoped, but without names. These were not marked graves. These were bodies consigned to silence. At the far end of the chamber, a small recessed alcove caught my eye. It was different, cleaner, protected somehow. Inside it, resting on a cracked tile, was a rosary, wooden beads, dark with age, the crucifix still intact, the cord frayed but unbroken. I knelt. The feeling that washed over me was unlike anything I had ever known. Sorrow, yes, but also faith, so deep, so enduring. It felt like it had been waiting centuries to be witnessed. I touched the rosary, and the moment my fingers closed around it, I felt a pulse of warmth. Not physical, spiritual. I whispered a prayer, then another. Then I wept. When I returned to the surface, I held the rosary in both hands. Everyone fell silent. This was hers. I said simply, we took it back to the chapel. That evening, I placed the rosary on the altar. The sanctuary was lit only by candles. The light danced over the crucifix, flickered in the stained glass, and glinted off the worn beads. I offered a mass for the forgotten souls. The pews were fuller than I had seen them since I arrived. There were no hymns, only silence, no sermon, only prayer. I spoke each word with the weight of centuries behind them. Lord, we commend to your mercy all those who have died unknown and unloved by this world. Those whose names were not carved in stone but remain written in your heart. Especially Maria, especially the ones still waiting. May they rest in your eternal peace. One by one, the villagers approached the altar. They lit candles. Some knelt, others touched the rosary with trembling fingers. When the last prayer was spoken, I looked toward the tabernacle and felt the chapel swell, not with sound, but with presence. I could not explain it, only that it felt like someone saying, I remember. That night, I returned to the hill. The air was still, the wind had softened, fog curled around the crosses like gentle arms. I stood near the broken crucifix, where I had seen her last. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I felt a hand touch mine, small, weightless, Then nothing. But I knew she was at peace, and so was I. Chapter 6. The Last Tear. Peace does not come like thunder. It does not arrive in grand proclamations or sweeping gestures. It comes gently, like a candle flickering in the dark, a breath you didn't know you were holding, a tear that no longer needs to fall. In the days following the Mass, the village changed, subtly, quietly. People lingered longer in the chapel after services. They walked the cemetery paths not with fear, but with reverence. Candles were left on stone ledges. Rosaries hung on fence posts. Children no longer rushed past the hill, but stopped to ask questions. And so, when I suggested a candlelit procession for the next All Souls' Day, no one hesitated. It began at dusk. The villagers gathered at the foot of the hill, each holding a white candle. I walked at the front, bearing the wooden rosary we had found in the crypt. It hung from my hand like a bridge between worlds. The sun was sinking, casting long shadows across the stones. But the hill, for the first time, did not feel heavy with silence. It felt expectant, like something sacred was about to unfold. We walked slowly, in prayer. Some recited the rosary, others simply wept. There were young faces, old faces, families who had left and returned. Even Joaquin, who now used a cane, joined us, his steps slow but determined. When we reached the broken crucifix, I placed the rosary at its base and knelt. "Maria," I whispered. The wind stirred the grass. The candles flickered, but held steady. We stood in silence, long enough to hear the night. But there was no cry. For the first time in living memory, there was no sound from the earth. Only peace. That night, Clara came to me. She was an orphaned girl, barely 17, living with her aunt, quiet, watchful. She had always lingered in the back pews, never speaking much. She knocked on the rectory door with trembling hands and asked if she could speak. I made her tea. We sat beneath the dim kitchen lamp. I saw her, she said, eyes wide. Last night, in my dream, I waited. She stood by the broken cross. But it wasn't broken anymore. It was whole, clean, and there were flowers all around it. White ones, like stars. Her voice cracked. She smiled at me, and she said, "Thank you for remembering." I felt a tear slip down my cheek. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. Grace. I wrote everything down that night in my journal. Not just Clara's dream, but the procession, the silence, the strange, holy quiet that had settled over the hill. And I wrote this: sometimes, all it takes is one prayer, one flame, one name whispered in the dark, to show the way home. From that year forward, every November 2nd, the village of Santa Lucia holds its vigil, not just for Maria, but for all the forgotten. No names are spoken aloud. Instead, we carry candles through the fog, and we let the silence remember for us. And though I have grown older, and the stones have grown softer, and the world spins faster than it used to, I still kneel at the foot of the broken crucifix each year. And I whisper, "Peace be with you." And somewhere, I believe, someone whispers back, Chapter 7. The Silent Hill. Time, like fog, softens everything. I am no longer a young priest. My hands tremble now when I hold the chalice. My hair is gray, thinner each season, but my heart has only grown fuller and quieter. I still live here, in Santa Lucia, the same rectory, the same church. The bell in the tower rings slower now, but its voice remains steady. Like mine, the village has changed over the years. Children now run along the cobbled paths where once only elders walked. New families have moved in, bringing with them life, laughter, new candles, new songs. But the hill has not changed. It still rises gently behind the chapel, veiled in ivy and moss. The gate still groans when opened. The stones still glisten after the rain. The broken crucifix remains, though lovingly tended, and flowers appear there with no name attached. No one hears the crying anymore. Some ask me why. They wonder, had it all been imagination, folklore, shared hysteria? But those who were there, they know. They remember the night of the procession, the scent from the crypt, the silence that followed. Silence is not the absence of sound. Sometimes it is the presence of peace. A few years ago, we placed a small stone marker near the broken cross. The parishioners had come together, raising funds and ideas, each contributing what they could. It was Joaquin, our old caretaker, who carved the inscription by hand before he passed. For the forgotten souls, God has never forgotten you. Pilgrims visit now, not many, just enough. They bring prayers and tears and sometimes questions. Some leave notes. Some sit for hours, as I once did, and I sit with them when I can, telling them the story, not as a ghost tale, but as a testimony, a lesson in mercy, in remembrance, in the quiet power of one name whispered in faith. Sometimes I visit the crypt. It is clean now, respected, a place not of fear, but of sacred rest. The wooden rosary lies in a glass case in the chapel, beside a candle that never extinguishes. We call it the flame of the forgotten. It is tended daily. Each year, on November 2nd, the candlelight procession continues. It has become tradition. No one commands it. It simply happens. A quiet tide of souls remembering other souls. Clara, now grown, often reads the psalm at the crucifix. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And I, older than I thought I'd ever be, still kneel beside the stone and still whisper, Maria. Some evenings, I sit by the window of the rectory, watching the hill in the moonlight. It is silent, but never empty. Sometimes, when the wind stirs the tall grass just so, I remember that night, and I believe, truly, deeply, that what happened here was not a haunting. It was a healing, a divine one small miracle in a forgotten village. And I was only a witness. But even a witness can be changed forever. Some stories stay with us, not because they terrified us, but because they reminded us of something deeper, something sacred. The cry from the crypt is not a ghost story in the traditional sense. It's a story about remembrance, mercy, and the quiet grace that can bloom even from the darkest soil. It's about how the dead are not truly gone if we hold them in prayer. About how even one soul, forgotten by the world, can be embraced again through faith. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "I will not leave you orphaned, I am coming to you." John chapter 14 verse 18. And in the book of Isaiah, we are reminded, even if a mother forgets her child, I will never forget you. Isaiah chapter 49 verse 15. Maria's story is every soul's story, longing to be remembered, to be named, to be lifted in prayer. And through that remembrance, heaven touches earth. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story moved you, even in a small way, I invite you to subscribe, share it with someone who believes in grace, and light a candle for someone who may no longer have anyone left to remember them. Until next time, peace be with you, and may your own path always be guided by the quiet voice of mercy.